Good morning, All Souls Community Church. It's Friday, May 15th. The question for you as we begin our weekend together: how do you know when you've gotten a haircut? Well, last week I pointed to sideburns that were a little too long, and maybe these aren't quite as long anymore. And I pointed to some hair that was a little high, and maybe it's not quite as high anymore. Yeah, you see, change can and does happen. How do you know when change is happening? You can see it. There is concrete evidence of it. And this week we've been looking at these stories of mothers in the scriptures in honor of Mother's Day, looking at lives that have fallen apart and how God has come in and done what only God can do: redeem, where he has taken broken things and put them back together. He's taken the rubble and rebuilt. And this day, Friday, I want us to end our week by looking at another story of another mother named Hannah. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we find her story, and it's the story of God beginning to rebuild. The nation of Israel had been broken down. The cycles of the judges had worn down the nation itself, and God was getting ready to establish his kingship through David, first through Saul and then David. And God decided that he needed to raise up a priest that would follow him, a priest that would be able to anoint the king and usher in this new season in Israel's history. Well, as maybe shouldn't be a surprise to us because of how many mothers, and in particular barren mothers, we've seen even this week in our study of the scriptures. This story begins with another barren woman, a wife named Hannah who is mourning. She is crying out. Year after year, she and her husband go to the temple to make their sacrifices, and year after year, she cries out before God. And this particular year, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, she is so distraught over the ache in her heart to have a child, crying out before the Lord in the temple, that the priest at the time, Eli, who was not a very godly man, sees her and thinks that she's drunk because she's so distraught. Her lips are moving, but nothing's coming out, and she's probably shaking and weeping and weeping and weeping. And Eli takes her to be drunk, and she says to him, "Do not take me to be some worthless woman. My soul, I'm pouring out my soul before the Lord." And Eli's response is, "Well, then may the Lord give you your heart's desire." And as the text goes on, it says that God did, in fact, do that. God remembered Hannah's prayers, and that year she conceived and gave birth to a boy that she named Samuel. Samuel, which means heard of God. God heard Hannah's cry. And then after the baby was weaned and of age, Hannah takes Samuel to the temple and says, "Here, Lord, you gave him to me. Now he's going to be for your service forever." And Samuel is the one who becomes the priest who then anoints King Saul and then anoints King David and ushers in the kingdom that eventually brings Jesus. Why am I telling you this? Well, because this week we've been talking a lot about lives that have come crumbling down and the push to believe that there's a God who can take that stuff and put it back together. And what I want you to see as we end this week together is that there is something that God calls us to be doing in the in-between. When we can see the crumbling, but it's maybe not yet done. Or when we think there's crumbling coming and we're not quite sure. What are we supposed to do? Well, God tells us through the story of Hannah this: we are to cry out. We're to be poured out like a drink offering, like Hannah before the Lord. Why? Because he wants to see us grovel? No, because that is a picture of such intimacy. Hannah believed God. She knew him to be good, and she knew she could cry out against the brokenness that was in her body, and around her in the world, as she was ridiculed by the other women, as she was crying out, "God, help me." She was crying because she believed that God loved her. And what God absolutely wants us to develop in the in-between, between the time of promise, or even just the time of looking at his character, and the time of fulfillment, the desires of our hearts. He says he wants us to cry out to him day after day, to develop an intimate relationship where we begin to believe in our hearts, even before we see with our eyes, that he's better than we thought, that he is more able, that he's actually at work, that even when it takes years and years for us to see it come to fruition, that God's goodness always reveals itself. He is wiser than we are. His plan is better than our plan. So today, no matter what you've been wrestling with this week, God's invitation is to come and to cry out to him. It reminds me of the words of the psalmist, where he says that children are a heritage from the Lord, right? The psalmist promises that God's the one who gives us children. And a lot of us are familiar with that passage, but do you know that in Psalm 127, that passage, that the part that comes immediately before that says this: unless the Lord builds the city, those who labor to build it labor in vain. Do you hear it? The crumbling walls, the rebuilding, God's the one who does the rebuilding. Unless the Lord watches over that city, those who stay awake all night long to watch over the city stay awake in vain. In vain, we rise early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. Doesn't this season so often feel like anxious toil because we're trying to control something that we cannot control? But the Lord gives to his beloved rest. This weekend, God wants you to rest in him, in his goodness, in his ability, in his plan, in his love for you. The Lord gives to his beloved rest. The way you enter into that is through prayer, being honest about your wrestlings, crying out to him, not because you need to change his heart and make him good, but because he is good. And he promises to change your heart and your life. Today, this Friday, go after him. Pray. Give your heart to him. He is worthy. He is good. And he loves you. Have a great weekend.